All right. It looks like it's a little after 11. Thank you for everyone for joining. I appreciate it. Sorry, I kind of left it too late to the last minute to get a night. So certainly appreciate y'all being able to come during the day. Um, and I will turn it over to John, who I know you all have enjoyed his presentation so far, and we'll learn about POCDs today. So this will be fun.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Good to see you again. Yeah, we're going to run through. Hopefully, it'll be a little bit less than an hour, but you can all say that I spoke at 1.5 speed, so we can count it for an hour session, or we can have some discussion or questions at the end. I'm going to go ahead. Oh, Dan, could you enable screen sharing? Okay. Um, wait, let me just switch it. Okay, that should hopefully be a bit more like it. Maximize and start the presentation. Does it look more or less like a PowerPoint presentation? Okay, great. Okay. So again, for folks I have not met or this is their first training I've done, I'm John Wiskowski. I'm a land use planner with Tyche Planning and Policy Group, but work with the town of Portland in the land use office, helping with zoning and economic development stuff. Um, so this is a training that is held in association with and counts for your mandatory training time that was mandated by Public Act 2129, in which all planning, zoning, and zoning board of appeals members need 4 hours of training, basically within the next week or so by January 1st. Going back to a slide that actually we talked about at the in the first training I did with Portland this fall about the different powers and duties of planning, zoning, and ZBAs. One of the important, a couple of the very important duties of the Planning Commission, which is a separate entity in the statutes from the Zoning Commission, although obviously many to most municipalities do combine those two commissions. The responsibilities are set. And under the planning statutes, a couple of the duties of the Planning Commission is the adoption and amending of the Plan of Conservation and Development, the local plan, conservation and development. This is not something that is the responsibility of the Board of Selectmen or the town meeting or the zoning commission or anyone else. It is the duty of the Planning Commission. And as part of that authority, the general statutes also assign the review of proposed municipal improvements to the Planning Commission. And so anytime a municipality is looking to do something significant with town lands, which is to say, accepting, widening, narrowing a public street, bridge, or parkway or other public way, um, acquiring land or improving land for the purpose of municipal facilities, airports, parks, playgrounds, schools, or other public properties, selling any of the same, extending public housing developments, or doing significant improvements to extending public utilities for water, sewer, power, transit, that sort of thing. All of those improvements, acquisitions, dispositions of land have to be referred to the Planning Commission for their comment, and specifically for their comment and report relative to the goals of the Plan of Conservation and Development. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. The report based on that review is must be submitted back to the town, generally the Board of Selectmen or whoever's convening a town meeting within 35 days. If the Planning Commission does not submit, then the whole process doesn't need to be held up on their account. They're basically given 35 days if you act. The trick here, and this is one of the rare, truly, I think, powerful abilities of the Planning Commission, is should the Planning Commission determine that the proposed improvements, let's say, acquisition of a piece of land for a school, or sale of a piece of land that was sort of designated for open space or something like that. If the planning commission determines that that action by the town would be incompatible with the plan of conservation and development, incompatible with the town's overall goals, it would issue a negative report. And that negative report would actually force a change in the required town meeting vote or legislative body vote, however the town of Portland approves, something like a sale of a piece of land, or sales or acquisition of a piece of land, presumably town meeting. And should the planning commission find that incompatible, the required town meeting vote to approve that change would go from a simple majority, standard town meeting vote, to a 2/3 supermajority. And so it would really force a significant majority of the population to, choose to do this move that the planning commission determines is actually not in keeping with the plan of conservation and development. That review, however, again, does not apply to sort of routine maintenance. If you're just fixing sidewalks, fixing roads, repairing infrastructure that's already in place, doing routine maintenance or upgrades on school systems. But it is sort of a rare hammer that the planning commission does have over large scale municipal decisions, which is an important role to play. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about the plan of conservation and development itself, and why, what it is, what is required of it, and why it's assigned to the planning commission. So section 8-23, and I will apologize. This is, a training intended to impart, a significant amount of information. So there will be, on a couple of these slides, a fair number of words. So I apologize to either force you to read or force you to listen to me reading sections of this, but it's important stuff in the statutes. So basically, this section 823 of the statutes requires every municipality, every planning commission in every municipality, at least every 10 years, shall prepare and amend and adopt a new plan of conservation and development, and then requires the municipality to regularly review and maintain that plan. The community could adopt, interim improvements, interim updates, maybe write a plan over a period of time and kind of update it as it goes. It can amend it at any time. It doesn't need to be locked in for 10 years. Most communities, and I think this is true of Portland historically, does basically a single substantial update basically every decade or so. Some communities, Old Saybrook, I'd point to in particular, had a long history of sort of doing a constant revision and update to their plan of conservation and development, by which I mean they would essentially update one chapter every year. And over the course of, as it turns out, like 3 decades. So actually, they just got done ending that practice, and they did basically a single update. But there was the case in which their housing chapter, and again, because they updated one chapter every year for a long time, they had so many chapters that the housing chapter actually hadn't been updated in 19 years, which had missed, 2 boom and bust cycles and COVID and, a couple of housing bubbles. And so, needless to say, they decided that was not the way they wanted to do it. But that is an option, that a community can sort of do a gradual update over a series of years. And so the 10-year cycle is basically, the outer limits of when a community needs to update these plans. Portland has actually, it has a plan that it was adopted in 2016. So we're coming up on 8 years into that current plan. The way that the Portland plan was structured, and hopefully people have seen this before, was a strategic element in which a lot of the substance was discussed, and the demographics were reviewed, and trends and conditions were reviewed, and then it had a separate document called the implementation element, which actually then sort of took all of the strategy and analysis and boiled it down to a series of action steps that were then assigned to different entities, boards and commissions and departments in town. Um, one is essentially sort of the plan, the other is sort of the action strategy. And again, so this is coming up on about 8 years, and I think the town is probably going to start um, its update process over the next couple of, well, I would say probably within the next year or so. A couple of the elements, and again, so this is from Section 8-23 of the Connecticut General Statutes, that these are the shalls, which is to say that these are the things that a plan of conservation and development must include as part of the update. And so it's development action plan. So essentially where development ought to happen or be intended to be built. Has to consider need for affordable housing, issues of public surface and drinking water supplies, use of cluster development, consistent with soil types. And so this is, again, as opposed to a sort of traditional Euclidean subdivision where you have, a cul-de-sac, 2 acre, 2 acre, 2 acre, 2 acre, all up around the cul-de-sac, to consider patterns of development that are defined elsewhere in the statutes, cluster, which is, smaller lots, lower infrastructure demands, more open space. So to consider that, and I think Portland has some consideration in its subdivision regulations of cluster, but that's a requirement. To take a look at the state plan of conservation and development and the regional plan conservation and development, which we'll talk about in a second. Some of the physical stuff, the reality on the ground, the physical, social, economic, and governmental conditions and trends. So, has a bunch of town land been developed? Is there a bunch of wetlands in town? Are there a number of brownfields? Is the nature of the government, sufficient to the needs of the community? What are the macroeconomic trends, in terms of housing, in terms of economic growth? Those things are intended to be considered in the plan, as well as the needs of municipality. And these needs are broad, human resources, education, health, housing, recreation, all of those things. So sort of, it's kind of that statement of where we are in Portland over the last 10 years. Where have we come from? What are the trends? What are the needs of our community in all different ways? A couple of these other things, 9 through 12, are sort of tacked on over time. That over time, the Connecticut General Assembly, the legislatures add things to the plan of conservation and development, saying, oh yeah, we forgot about this, or there's some interest group that says, oh, we really should think about this too. And so over the last couple of years, we've had energy efficient patterns of development, including solar energy, are asked to be considered. Preservation of agriculture, sea level change. This is a relatively new addition to the requirement. And so, the most recent, basically, sea level change, and that would be provided, I believe, through CIRCA, which is a research institute at UConn. And then technology infrastructure. And I think a lot of that one may have been added in response to COVID, when we had, kids learning at home, a lot of people working at home, and discovering that in a lot of our rural areas, broadband infrastructure was kind of poor, and people were having a hard time accessing, high-speed data for work at home or learn at home. And so technology infrastructure has been added to the mandate for plans of conservation and development. That towns need to think a little bit more thoughtfully about this. We mentioned that one of the requirements, or two of the requirements, were to assess the goals and compatibility with the state plan of conservation and development and the regional plan. In this case, the region that we're in is the Lower Connecticut River Valley Council of Governments, or RIPRCOG. They actually just completed their regional plan of conservation and development at the end of 2021. So it's just a little more than a year old at this point. Wait, no, end of 2021. So a little over 2 years old at this point. I'm sorry. And that was an extensive process that they went through. I think probably about a year and a half. They worked on this plan of conservation and development. And I would say if no one has read that, it's a decent summary of the goals of the member towns, with some nods towards connectivity in things like transportation and trails and open spaces, and economic development without a lot of top-down mandates. I think because of the structure of the regional council of governments, which is it's a board of directors made up of the chief elected officials of all of the municipalities. So Ryan Curley is on the board of Rivercog, as are all the other first selectmen and mayors in the I think what's 17 town Rivercog area. So it tends to be a bottom up reflection of the goals of the collected town. I think in something of a contrast, the state of Connecticut's plan of conservation and development, or they call it the Conservation and Development Policies Plan, um, attempts to take a little bit of a gentle top-down approach, in which they have established 6 growth management principles, which sort of are sort of a general smart growth agenda, or several sort of best practices when it comes to smart growth. However, the state does not call it smart growth. This is something that is a relic of the Jody Rell administration, which, not to get too political here, Governor Rell being a Republican, at the time, the phrasing smart growth was seen as a sort of progressive Democrat agenda, even though the principles, I think, are relatively universal and uncontroversial. So Governor Rell referred to these principles, as well as the office responsible for that, responsible growth principles. So Connecticut has an Office of Responsible Growth, not a smart growth office. I'd note that the state plan is required to be updated every 5 years. The most current one took quite a while to update, and in fact wasn't actually adopted. The 2018 to 2023 plan was not actually adopted until 2022. So it was adopted 4 years into its cycle, and they're actually in process of writing a new plan right now, because 2023 is just about over. So we need to have a new plan for 2023 to 20. Actually, what it's going to be is 2024 to 2029. But the interesting thing I'd note is the actual substance of the plan from 2028 to, I'm sorry, 2018 to 2023, our current plan. The substance is almost identical to the letter and semicolon and policies as the prior plan, the 2013 to 2018 plan. It's basically the same thing. And in fact, the growth management principles have been literally the same for probably 20 years now. And again, because they're broad and fairly uncontroversial statements, the state hasn't seen all that much need to update them. And we'll go through those growth management principles in a little bit. So going back to the requirements of the Plan of Conservation and Development, these are also shalls. So these are things that must be reflected in the Plan of Conservation and Development. So it must be a statement of policies, goals, and standards for how the town wants to progress over the next decade. It has to provide for a system of principal thoroughfares. So it needs to address transportation, not only basic roads, but also, bridges, sidewalks, multipurpose trails, transit, that sort of thing. It has to provide for the coordinated development of the municipality and the general welfare. So there needs to be some designation of elements of conservation and development. They can't just say, we want to keep everything the same and we want to grow. That isn't really particularly coordinated. There should be some designation of, here's an area we want to preserve, here's an area we grow. So there needs to be some efficient coordination there. And then again, as I said, the most desirable use of land, which is generally reflected in our zoning map. which ideally is sort of the implementation of the goals. So if the town says we want to develop the riverfront area to take advantage of um, recreation as well as marine-based commerce, well, then the zoning map should reflect that, and should make that sort of thing possible. Um, as opposed to, if the town wishes to preserve large chunks of, undisturbed forest blocks and things like that, certainly the zoning map and the zoning policies should reflect that as well. And there's, industrial uses, significant commercial uses, large multifamily should not be allowed in those areas of town that are designated for more conservation or agriculture. Some additional requirements, recommending the most desirable density of population. Again, there are areas of town, particularly in areas served by public sewer, public water, that are on transit lines, that are on state highways, that are near businesses. A population density can and should be higher. And the plan should reflect that, and vice versa. If there are areas of poor soils, of wetlands, of forest land, of agriculture, where you don't have public sewer and public water, lower density is appropriate. And the plan, the maps, and then ultimately regulations should reflect that. The plan should, in consideration of the state plan of conservation and development and the growth management principles that are listed here, but we'll talk a little bit more in a second, should indicate if there is some element of the local plan that is inconsistent with those growth management principles. And that happens sometimes, and we saw this, well, geez, years and years and years ago in the town of Suffield, where they were looking to locate a new high school and run the town's sewer line up into basically an area of preserved farms and prime farm soils. But there was a piece of land that the town had owned and identified as suitable for a new high school, that it wanted to locate essentially in an old farm field. And the state pointed out that was inconsistent, because that was conversion of farmland. It was extension of sewer into a conservation area, and it was extension of infrastructure into preservation area, and the state raised essentially some objections to providing funding to that. And so we can talk a little bit about the incompatibility issue in a bit, but that actually changes like that, and the issue that they had in Suffield actually changed the state's approach to addressing those incompatibilities and what to do about them. But it is a requirement currently in the statutes that the town has to say, yes, we are generally consistent. There are a couple of gray areas or areas of inconsistency for this reason or that, but that needs to be addressed. And then generally make provision for housing opportunities, which is obviously increasingly in the focus in our communities, where housing is scarce, hard to build, extremely expensive to build. And so the town needs to, in its plan, address that in some manner. And a couple of the final things also address relative to housing, housing choice and economic diversity, including for low and moderate income. This language was strengthened in the last couple of years, so there is an increase of focus in the state legislation to increase the focus of the plan of conservation and development requirements. And then also similarly, allowing for consideration of older adults and people with disabilities to live in their current homes and their current communities as long as possible and whenever possible. So not just an income consideration, but also an age and disability consideration in terms of housing. Okay. So in addition to those musts, those have tos, there are a number of may or things that the town can consider. And it's sort of a laundry list of other things that might be involved in elements of conservation or development in town, which is conservation of trap rocks and ridge lines, which is, important in some of those towns a little bit to our west that are along the Metacomet Trail or the Metacomet Ridge up the center of the state. Airports, parks, playgrounds, public spaces, schools, public utilities, including sewer, water, light, power, transit, public housing, um, to provide for implementation of the plan. So this is actually not required that a town should try to come up with some actual plan for how are we going to put this stuff in place, a schedule, a budget, and implement, like, who does this? Which land are we going to acquire? Which land are we going to sell? What are the corridor studies? These are all things that the town may do that are absolutely not required. Um, and then to take a look at priority funding. And then the town can also, elaborate its plans with supporting maps, photographs, charts, elements, and like that. That's stuff that is explicitly enabled but not required by the statute. Okay, so we've hinted at this a couple of times. The state's growth management principles. Oh, so, sorry. Which is essentially the state's smart growth agenda, which is known as the responsible growth agenda. So these are the things that the state has, again, for the past 2 decades, for the most part, highlighted these 6 principles. First is redevelopment and revitalization of commercial centers and areas of mixed-use land with existing or planned physical infrastructure. And I think that's something that we can obviously see here in Portland, right downtown, right, and in the heart of the downtown area. We have a major redevelopment plan where we happen to have state highway, public sewer, public water, road infrastructure in place, and an opportunity for this redevelopment. So instead of paving over a farm or cutting down a forest to accommodate this economic growth or housing growth, focus it in areas that have already been developed and are already established as commercial centers. Second is the expansion of housing opportunities and design choices for a variety of household types and needs. And so ideally that cuts across things like income or cultural heritage, family structure, but then also things like ages, so we want to provide for young families, people buying their first house or finding their first apartment, all the way through, growing families, and downsizers, empty nesters, and retirees, and folks. There should be opportunities for all of those stages and all of those cultural categories to exist in as many places as possible. The state has also focused on the third, which is concentration of development around transportation nodes and major transportation corridors, which is again, a land efficiency thing, and also to follow investment with investment. So it doesn't make sense to run a high-speed rail line, straight through the wilderness, and not provide any sort of opportunity for housing along, stops. And similarly, where the state has already invested in, in Metro North or the Hartford line, or other major transit infrastructure, that we should focus as much development as possible around those areas for travel efficiency, for economic efficiencies. And so it's, there's a very strong TOD focus. And over the last couple of legislative cycles, there has been a lot of sort of follow-up focus on trying to encourage or require municipalities that do have these transit hubs, maybe they have a Metro North station or they have a Hartford line station, to change their zoning, to allow for more development, more mixed-use development, more housing development, more affordable housing development in these transit areas. The fourth is conservation and restoration of the natural environment, as well as cultural and historic resources and existing farmlands. So again, this is sort of the conservation end of this, that we recognize we have a number of very, very important resources of different types in Connecticut. Obviously, both natural history and natural resources and cultural resources that should be restored, enhanced, preserved. as well as the protection of environmental assets critical to public health and safety. And so these are things like public drinking supply, aquifers, and watersheds, where we have keeping our water quality and our water resource elements is extraordinarily important to the continued success of our communities. So making sure that those things are sufficiently protected, as things like wetlands regulation as well, and then the integration of planning, and this is uh, probably of these the most um, aspirational and least delivered upon. For a very small state, Connecticut is sort of notorious for having a disconnected um, planning process where all towns are sort of on their own, and different state agencies kind of do their own thing and many times in sort of cross purposes to each other. Um, and so the goal is, it's an important principle that there should be coordinated planning across all levels of government and all entities. And that one has been probably the biggest challenge of those, at least administratively. But those are the growth management principles, and those are the ones that ideally the town's plan will also reflect. So again, in the case of Portland, the idea would be to preserve our natural resource areas, those areas of farm and forest land, um, sort of away from the downtown, but in focusing economic growth in the downtown and housing opportunities in those areas of infrastructure. And I think, generally speaking, that the town has reflected that. But if it does not, that needs to be pointed out in the plan of conservation and development. As for the adoption and drafting process, again, this is charged to the Planning Commission, who is solely responsible for adopting it. The actual process for developing the plan of conservation and development is significantly more open-ended. Obviously, we just went through a whole bunch of stuff that must be in and must be considered, but exactly what the process is very broad. So many times the Planning Commission or the PZC establishes an ad hoc subcommittee in which several members of the Planning Commission are involved, but then also members at large from the community, or someone from the Board of Selectmen, someone from economic development, someone from conservation, someone from the Chamber of Commerce or the business community, someone from a bike and pedestrian advocacy group, sort of forms the committee that leads this. Sometimes these things are done in-house. If you have sort of professional staff that's kind of up to the job and wanted to take this on, a lot of times the management of the development of the plan is outsourced to a private consultant who kind of leads the town through the process and helps to draft this. I believe the current plan was developed with this help from Planometrics, if I'm not mistaken. But there are a number of development consultants that can help with that as well. In terms of the actual nuts and bolts of the approval, once a draft is developed, but before the public hearing is held, and there must be a public hearing held. This is not something that the Planning and Zoning Commission can just sort of adopt on the fly. So before the public hearing process, the plan must be sent to the Council of Governments as well as the state 65 days ahead, and then at least 35 days ahead of the public hearing. It needs to be posted with the town clerk's office and posted on the town's website for public access and review and notification. Two legal notices need to go in the newspaper still. And then following the public hearing process, if there are changes, if there are objections, the town can make some modifications. When the actual plan is adopted, it needs to be notified in the paper, it needs to be posted on the website, and it needs to be sent to OPM, the Office of Policy and Management, for review. At this point, the state actually has no mandate or authority to sort of look through the local plan and say, nope, we got a problem here, or you missed talking about housing, or you didn't mention sewer lines. There is no current statutory authority for OPM to sort of raise those objections. And in fact, I mentioned earlier that there is, there were some times when the state goals and responsible growth principles butted up against what the local plan said. In the example of Suffield putting a high school in a farm field, the state changed their process to basically be deferential to local plans. Um, and so if there is a conflict between the state growth management principles and the local plan of conservation and development, the state will defer to the town and will not um, punitively withhold funding or privileges to that community. So as long as the town goes through its process, drafting, public hearing, notification, the state will generally defer to the local plan, which I don't know. I mean, that's sort of a larger political question. Like, should the state take a heavier hand, or should municipalities be left to essentially choose their own priorities themselves? I'll leave that to the side. But if the only penalty currently on the books is if the state, if, excuse me, if the town does not um, adopt a plan at least every 10 years, the town could become ineligible for discretionary state funds. And by that, we mean things like STEEP grants, which is small town economic assistance grants, lot SIP grants, which tend to be road and sidewalk infrastructure grants, open space land acquisition grants, farmland preservation grants. So it's not things like town aid road or school budgetary money or things like that. Those are not considered discretionary state funds, but the town would find itself very quickly at the bottom of a lot of grants, a lot of grant application priorities if the town does not adopt that. If, in certain cases, and actually this is happening right now in Madison, where the town of Madison is a couple of months overdue for their 10-year plan. But they've been working on it basically for the last year and a half, very diligently. It's just taken a little bit longer. So in that case, it's just a letter needs to go to OPM from the chief elected officer to say, listen, please don't withhold funds. We're working on it. We're getting there. It's in progress. So the state, once the 10-year window, it's not a guillotine that comes down, but it does trigger a process so the town, remains eligible for some of these funds. A little bit on the town's plan, which I'm sure most of you know better than I do. It focused on, it was actually had a number of key goals, which, A through, I think, A through P or something like that. So, and in these sort of broad principles, strengthening the town centers, promoting appropriate redevelopment of Elmcrest, enhancing the riverfront, addressing zoning, industrial zoning, establish the airline trail, and so on, looking at natural resources, historic resources, cultural resources, and then continuing to guide appropriate development, economic development, residential development, and then looking at infrastructure needs, community facilities, vehicular transportation, walking, cycling, transit, and utilities. So if you think about that list of things that we looked at that the state says you must look at, that's actually very, very well reflected in the way that the Portland Plan of Conservation and Development is structured. So we're looking at vehicular traffic, community facilities, economic development, and then we look here at housing and farms and cultural resources and historic resources. So all of the things, there's a very clear through line from state requirements to the way that the Portland Plan is structured. And then the Portland Plan in each of these areas, so if you note like strengthening the town center and promoting appropriate redevelopment, each of those principles or broad goals is then blown out in the implementation guide. So and is broken down into individual policies and actions that are then assigned. So this is in the implementation element of the Plan of Conservation and Development, where we actually have this what we refer to as an implementation table. So that encouraging appropriate development in the town center. What are we going to do specifically? And so if you look down at the action items, it's reviewing the town regulations to increase the variety and density of activities allowed within the town center. That's how, we have a principle. This is what we want to do. How do we do it? Look to the action item. And then who is responsible for that action item? We see that the Planning and Zoning Commission, because they're the ones that control zoning regulations. So if we want to encourage growth in the town center, make it easier to develop or redevelop the town center, that's very often a zoning thing. And so this follows in a lot of those policies and principles, then there are actions associated with it as part of the plan. And so another example of policies and actions. So enhancing connections in the town center. Certainly, this is the town and the land use office. Certainly, First Selectman Curley's office has been very active over the last several years in terms of enhancing connections to the town center. All kinds of sidewalk improvement money is being invested in town. That's an element of implementation to get to responding to those policies. And so that is similar throughout the entire implementation table, which is quite long, but I won't go through it. And so some of those ways that once the plan of conservation and development is established, how is it then actually used? And it's those implementation elements. What are the action items that the town in its various entities and boards and commissions and departments can do to make this happen? And so, you see a sidewalk enhancement project that was funded by a grant that was acquired because it was established as a goal in the plan of conservation and development. We want to encourage connections. These connections are sidewalk infrastructure. Or economic development initiatives that we want to look at, tax abatements or brownfield redevelopment along the riverfront to sort of encourage broader development to come over from Middletown into Portland, as well as enhancing the town center or the airline trail through Portland. These are all priorities established in the plan of conservation and development that then point to specific actions, grants, funding, policy changes that would get undertaken in order to make the vision of the plan of conservation and development happen. And then one of the most significant ways is specifically through zoning changes. So if there are places that the town wants to protect as a matter of policy, it very often then falls to the Planning and Zoning Commission to make those policies reflected in its zoning map and in its zoning regulations. And so ideally, in a sort of perfect situation, the policies of the plan of conservation and development should be clearly reflected in the zoning map. So if the town wants to protect floodplain and scenic vistas and forests along the Connecticut River, those areas should be zoned for very low impact activity. Or similarly, if we want to encourage marina use, industrial use along the river, those areas should be developable and encouraged a high level of density and certain types of land uses. The majority of the town is to be residential. So it should be reflected in a residential zone. But again, per the growth management principles, the downtown areas, the community centers that have public sewer and public water and business and civic uses should be zoned in a way that allows those things and in fact encourages that sort of density. And I think a number of changes over the years in Portland has done a good job in reflecting some of that. It's not a perfect system, and there's only so much that a set of zoning regulations can do. Some of the rest has to fall to the market. Housing markets, developers, as well as things like the limitations of municipal budgets or state budgets for infrastructure improvements. If we really want to extend sewer lines to an area of town that could use it, it's not always in the budget or it's not always a state priority. So, but it's in the plan, ideally, and the hope is that over the 10-year cycle, we will get there or we will get closer to that goal. And then finally, as we said before, the municipal improvements. So any time the town is going to be making these changes, it should be reflected or compared to the plan of conservation and development. And if it does not meet that plan of conservation and development, the town should really rethink, what are we doing here? Or is there a better option? Is there a better place for this development or this land acquisition, this open space, this school, if it really does not reflect the goals of the plan of conservation and development. Okay, so that actually talked for longer than I thought I would. We're now at quarter of, and I would be happy to take questions.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Hi, Barbara. I'm Barbara Sequenzia. Well, first of all, I was wondering what happened with the high school plan in Suffield. Did they ever build it on the farmland or not?
They did. They
They
did.
did.
Yeah. And it was, I mean,
Okay.
you know, the problem, you know, it's the blessing and the curse with a place like Suffield. I mean, Suffield is in the Connecticut River Valley, obviously up north, part of Glacial Lake Hitchcock. So basically, the entire eastern half of Suffield is amazing prime farm soils. And so you can't really do anything in Suffield without disturbing some prime farm soils. But they did ultimately build it.
Okay. And also I'm not sure who was on the planning commission in Portland.
I know Bob is, but Dan, you
Yeah, so we have a combined planning and zoning commission. Most towns do.
Okay.
Some towns it's separate, but yeah, but
Okay.
Bob Ellsworth is our chair. Chantel
Okay.
Foster is our vice chair, and then Carolyn is on as well. And
Okay.
then other members are Victoria DeChechet, Rob Taylor, Jen Talone, why am I forgetting? Tom Bransfield, and then
Okay.
yeah, and Ken Kearns is currently, but he's switching places. Brian Anzalotti is taking his alternate spot.
All right. Thank you.
John, I had a question. It's Bob. Could you speak for a minute about your thoughts on the public's involvement in the review, update, and approval of the PLCD?
the public's involvement of it.
Yeah. How much should they be involved, and
Yeah.
what's the best way to get the public involved?
I think it really does. I don't want to weasel out of the answer, but it does vary from town to town. And I think what we've found is effective. So you know, just sort of putting it out there, like, you know, advertising on the town website or putting it in like a town newsletter saying, oh, we're gonna have a community conversation about this. Come one, come all. That doesn't necessarily grab people.
Right.
And you know, it kind of, if people even notice it, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other in many ways. So effective things that we have done or we have seen in other towns is going out to neighborhood groups. And I'm going to get this wrong. We actually helped write the plan of conservation and development across the river in Middletown a couple of years ago. And there's that large residential community out near 95. I can't remember the name of it. It's
Like Westlake.
Westlake. Thank you.
Westlake. Yeah.
Yeah. So we actually, and they have it's a very large residential neighborhood, and they have a pretty well organized community association. We actually went to a couple of meetings. You know, basically got on the agenda of their homeowners association to kind of talk about the different opportunities and development challenges, to kind of get their opinions. We also did surveys that were advertised through Facebook, like targeted Facebook ads. And then in Middletown, and also in what we did in Essex and in Madison, other towns I've been involved with, we would do, as part of planning and zoning commission meetings, we do targeted listening sessions on different topics. So we would do an economic development listening session and would specifically invite the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Association and the Economic Development Commission, and some key employers in town that were stakeholders for that topic. And we would try to get their input on that. Similarly, on elements of conservation, we would invite members of the Land Trust and the Conservation Commission and the Wetlands Commission, as well as, you know, groups like, you know, Bike Ped or airline trail users, to again come in and talk specifically about that issue. So there are, you know, specific invitations, and then as well as things like community survey, like you know, a good Survey Monkey thing that's well advertised and promoted through all the different channels, the town's social media and e-blasts and things like that. But the answer generally is kind of like all of the above. Let's try a bunch of different approaches, but it will vary from town to town.
Because the POCD should ideally reflect the wants of the townspeople.
It's true, but I will caveat that by saying it's not a popular vote or a referendum. The Planning and Zoning Commission, or the Planning Commission, is still responsible for sorting through all the data and coming up with an understanding of what fits best based on that data. And public opinion, you could get 99% approval and clamor for a combination Whole Foods and Amazon World Headquarters, right, in Portland. But the demographics aren't going to support that. You're never going to get Amazon World Headquarters. And so it doesn't matter how popular it is. It doesn't necessarily belong in the plan of conservation and development because it's not reality. And so Planning and Zoning Commission needs to take, the public opinion as a piece of data, as an important piece of data, but also balance it against, all right, we are, ledgy, and we have brownfields, and we have wetlands and floodplain, and this kind of development isn't necessarily going to work here, or we have an aging infrastructure, and some of these upgrades are going to be cost prohibitive or are necessary in order to do this. So the idea is, the Planning Commission should take all of that data, public input being one piece, but not everything.
Yep, got it. Thanks.
That's kind of my opinion, but I think it's also a pretty solid argument. Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Anybody else? Okay, I guess hearing none. Just want to thank John once again for putting this on and doing another presentation. I think it really helps everybody out, and I think everybody's gotten a lot out of it. I certainly have gotten some praise about these for some past things. So certainly, John, we appreciate your expertise. Please let me know if you guys have any follow-up questions or anything like that. And I guess with that, we're pretty much close to an hour. Just want to wish everybody a happy holidays, happy New Year, and yeah, I guess we'll catch you guys in January.
Thank you, John. That was very
Okay.
helpful.
All right.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays.
Thank you, John.
Thank you,
Happy
John.
holidays, everyone.